I'm going to be doing a TPCASTT poetry analysis of Wallace Stevens' poem The Snow Man, which can be found on pages 723 to 724 in the textbook. The T in TPCASTT stands for title, so before I even began reading the poem, I looked at the title and took a guess at what the poem might be about. The first thing I noticed was that the snowman is 2 words instead of 1. This led me to believe that the snowman might be more figurative than literal, or that it might be about an actual man. Furthermore, the word snowman to me evoked feelings of coldness, yet it also made me think of peace, simplicity, and childhood happiness. I thought of kids laughing and playing in the snow. Some other ideas that popped into my head were that snowmen have a quiet wisdom. After they are built and the fun's all over, they sit in the stillness of a winter's day, observing all that goes on around them. And finally, another route of thought that I had was that snowmen are stuck in place and very much a part of and made up of their surroundings. So I came up with some possibilities of what the poem could be about. Maybe it was about a person who views life simplistically and has childlike ease. It could be about a wisdom attained from being at one with your surroundings, or a peaceful winter day, or maybe just someone who is stuck in life and helpless to do anything about it. This is the actual poem, which I will read for you. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crested with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place, for the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. And this is my paraphrase version of the poem on the right. A person must have a cold, winter-like mind in order to look upon the frost and the branches of the pine trees covered in snow, and they must have experienced cold for a while to gaze at the icy junipers and rough spruces in the January sun, and not be saddened by the sound of the wind or of a few leaves. The sound of the wind and leaves is also heard in another land, with the same wind blowing in the same empty place for a person who listens in the snow. But, not being anything himself, this person cannot behold what's right in front of him, nor what isn't in front of him. Now for the C in TPCASTT, connotation. Stevens' poem uses figurative language to create layered meanings. In the first line of his poem, he writes that one must have a mind of winter to look at their frost-covered and icy surroundings and to not think of any misery in the sound of the wind. Here, a mind of winter serves 2 purposes. Literally, one must be able to understand winter and be at one with it to see it for what it is, and figuratively, one must have wintry and unfeeling attitude towards winter in order to not project their own emotions onto it. And the same holds true for the line, and have been cold a long time. Here, Stevens means to imply that the snowman is both physically cold and mentally unfeeling. And really, we are able to have these double meanings because of the symbolism of the snowman. The snowman symbolizes the objective observer, while on the surface, the poem seems to be about an actual snowman in the winter. When you peel back the layers of the poem, it is clear that the poem is actually about humans and their perception of reality. Another literary element present in The Snowman is juxtaposition. 2 different types of minds are contrasted in the poem. The first, emotional and responsive, and the second, cold and unmoved. When describing the first type of mind, Stephen uses imagery that really emphasizes the beauty of nature and adds creativity to ordinary wintry scenery. He uses phrases like crested with snow, shagged with ice, and distant glitter. The first type of mind sees with emotion, and also hears with emotion. The word misery, describing the sound of the wind, is an emotionally charged word. The second type of mind is unfeeling. Stevens uses words like bare and nothing to describe the second type of mind. These words have no emotional connotation. They literally describe nothingness. Aside from juxtaposition, the snowman uses slant rhyme. Stevens writes that the snowman must have been cold a long time to look at the spruces glittering in the January sun and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow. The harsh-sounding D's at the end of wind and land create slant rhyme between the 2 words. They almost rhyme, but not quite. just as the two situations are almost the same, but not quite. The lands are the same, but the perception of the lands is different. Also, the D sound is harsh, not soft and emotional, but hard and unfeeling. And finally, our last four literary elements. First is repetition. Evergreen-like trees are repeated throughout the poem. Stephen writes about pine trees, junipers, and spruces. Evergreens are strong, sturdy constants. They're unmoved. No matter what we do to them, or even what we project onto them, they will stand strong and unchanged. This really emphasizes Stephen's point that our emotion and imagination does not, in actuality, change reality. Stevens also makes use of anti-anaclastus as he repeats the word nothing at the end of his poem. He writes, "And nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is." The nothing here is emphasized, and it also changes meaning throughout the lines. The observer is made of nothing, no substance or worthwhile viewpoint. The nothing that is not there is the imagination and emotion projected onto winter, and the nothing that is there is the winter itself, the reality. Stevens is emphasizing that without thought and emotion, everything is really nothingness. Furthermore, the term the nothing is actually slightly ironic because putting the word the in front of nothing makes it a something. Stevens is showing us that there is actually something in front of the listener, but it is meaningless. The next literary device is word connotation. The words cold, winter, bare, and nothing all have a sort of negative connotation. A wintry, unfeeling mindset gives one a bare interpretation of life that ultimately ends in nothingness. This isn't a good thing and creates a negative attitude. However, there's also this word behold that Stevens plops into his poem. Behold has more of a positive connotation. It is a word used to express reverence and revelation. The snowman beholds the nothingness that is around. And there is some revelation in recognizing that everything around the snowman is simply there. It has no emotion tagged onto it. The truth of it exists separately from our perception of it. Yet, without us to perceive it in an imaginative way, it is ultimately nothing. And finally, the last literary device I will talk about is zooming in and out. Well, actually, it's not really a literary device, but it's a pretty cool thing that Stevens does. Stevens' poem somewhat tries to get its reader out of their small little self-made realities and looking at the bigger world picture. While we need emotion to interpret life and find beauty in what is around us, Stevens points out that there is a bigger picture apart from our own interpretation. And his writing mirrors this transition from really focused in to stepping back. Stevens is constantly zooming in and out of his poem. He talks about the pine trees crusted with snow, which is a very close-up and zoomed-in picture. And then he talks about the distant glitter of the January sun, which is a very far away and zoomed out picture. Stevens does this again when he talks about the sound of the wind, which is a very broad and zoomed out picture. And then he talks about the sound of a few leaves, which is more narrow and zoomed in. When looking at the attitude of the poem is very much philosophical and meditative. The ending lines of the poem really get into Stevens' complex philosophy of life. And, as previously noted, that word behold, and also the word regard, reflects Stevens' reverent and enlightened positions towards life. He's just made a philosophical discovery about the world around him. His repeated nothings have a slightly dismal effect on the poem, as nothingness is not a state one wants to be in or something one wants to be surrounded by. And finally, the descriptions of winter, the pine trees crusted with snow, and the junipers shagged with ice, give off a reflective and aesthetically appreciative mood, which sheds some positive light on imagination. The snowman's major shift occurs at line 10, where Stevens writes, "which is the sound of the land full of the same wind." The first part of Wallace Stevens' poem is about what the snowman does. It describes how a snowman is able to strip the imaginative embellishments from reality. And then the second part of the poem is about why the snowman does what he does. It presents a philosophy of reality. So, looking back at the title, was my guess of what the poem was going to be about right? Well, not exactly. It's actually kind of ironic. Right away when I thought of a snowman, I had an emotional response and thought of childhood happiness, when in reality, according to this poem, snowmen have no emotion attached to them. Anyway, the title makes more sense now. The snowman is figurative. The snowman simply is. He has no feelings about winter and is able to take in the big picture. The snowman perceives everything around him without attributing emotion or imagination to it, and the coldness associated with the snow is a way of thinking. And finally, we come to theme. So based on my analysis, here are some possible themes I've drawn from this poem. First, it can be challenging to filter through one's emotions to extract reality. Secondly, when one ceases to project their own imaginative embellishments onto nature, they can move past looking at their own self-made realities and instead view the larger world of reality. However, if one becomes hardened to beauty and stiff towards imagination, that person fades into nothingness and loses their humanness. Third, imagination, while often in conflict with reality, brings life to the world. And last, it is healthy to recognize that emotion and imagination are things conceived in one's mind, not observed in nature. Yet, life would be boring and bare without. And that is the end of my tipcast. Thank you for watching.